to Dan, who's going to give us a formal introduction of our series today.
Thank you. Hello, and welcome to our Education Policy Seminar today. I am Dan Rodriguez, a PhD student in the Ed Policy program at UVA. This talk is part of the Education Policy Works seminar series sponsored by the Banker Fund for Political Economy. Each semester, Ed Policy Works hosts a number of talks from external and sometimes internal speakers on a host of education policy and research-related topics. These talks are free and open to the public. Our next speaker will be Dr. Kimberly Robinson on October 18th. For more information on Ed Policy Works or the next seminar, please visit our website. Today, we're delighted to welcome Alejandro Ghanimian. Alejandro is an assistant professor of applied psychology and economics at NYU. Alejandro's research focuses on how school systems in developing countries can ensure all children acquire basic skills by improving children's preparation for school, supporting teachers to cater to heterogeneous student groups, and helping principals use data to inform management practices. Today, Alejandro will be presenting a paper called Augmenting State Capacity for Child Development, Experimental Evidence from India. Alejandro will be talking for approximately 1 hour and will leave 20 minutes for discussion and questions. Please note that any additional or personalized questions after 1:30 can be addressed via email, as other meetings will be beginning at the time. Thank you for attending the Ed Policy seminar today, and let's welcome Alejandro now.
Thank you, Dan, for that lovely introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen. Give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Excellent. So thanks to everyone in Ed Policy Works, and especially to Beth Schuler for reaching out and extending this invitation. I am thrilled to be presenting to all of you today. What I'll be presenting is joint work with Karthik Muralijaran at UC San Diego and Christopher Walters at UC Berkeley. It's an impact evaluation of an extra worker intervention for preschool centers in the state of Tamil Nadu in India. Okay, as Shannon told you at the beginning, I'm happy to take clarifying questions throughout, and then to take any discussion questions that you might have towards the end. That way I can manage my time. And you can just go ahead and unmute yourself. Otherwise, I might just miss your questions. So just don't be shy. I love questions. All right, great. So in terms of motivation for our study, I think it's very clear that there's a growing consensus now among scholars from different disciplines about the importance of early childhood education. We mainly agree on 3 facts. We agree that children's development is affected by both psychosocial and biological factors, and also by genetic inheritance. We also agree that in the first years of life, vital development occurs across a number of domains. And we also agree that exposure to risk factors during this particularly important period can be detrimental to cognitive, motor, and social emotional development. So perhaps it's no surprise that because of the widely recognized importance of early childhood education, there has been a lot of policy experimentation about how to improve early outcomes and to do so through different strategies, especially providing children with high quality, high intensity, lasting opportunities to learn has been found to consistently prevent or ameliorate the loss of developmental potential. However, though, there is very little of that evidence that exists, especially in developing countries, that shows how to improve these outcomes at scale. If you look at the latest review that Aisha Yousafzai and some of her colleagues have put together on strategies to improve early childhood development through stimulation at scale in developing countries, most of those studies have very little, very sort of small sample sizes. And some of these are sort of pilots, others and sort of pilots from the government, but really few of those are actually fully implemented by the government and done at scale. So that's kind of where we think our contribution fits. India, as many of you might know, runs the largest early childhood education program in the world. It's called the Integrated Childhood Development Scheme, ICDS. I promise, I think I can fulfill this promise, that will be the first and last acronym that I introduce. I have read my presentation of all the acronyms, but call me out on it if you spot something else. So this system serves more than 36 million 3 to 6-year-olds for free, disproportionately to the poor. So this program was developed originally for the poorest areas of India, and then it was expanded to the rest of the country. It doesn't only provide education. So in that sense, it might be different to some of the systems that you might be familiar with. So it provides health services, nutrition services, and education services as well. In fact, Icds initially developed as a feeding system, then developed a greater concern for nutrition and then health, and only recently has been more advocated to education services. It does provide this service through about 1.35 Anganwadi centers. Anganwadi, literal translation, is courtyard shelter. That means they're sort of like preschool centers across the country. Let me show you a lovely picture of Anganwadi center, and this is the capital city of Tamil Nadu. So that's why this center is very spruced up, very colorful, very lively, and it is more spacious. The space of these centers varies quite a lot, as well as the enrollment, and it, of course, the infrastructure based on the context in which that is the centers are sort of set up, right? All the centers are staffed with only 2 workers, and this is super important to understand why the intervention that we evaluate becomes important. The first of those workers is called the Anganwadi worker, and she is responsible for more than 21 tasks across health, nutrition, and education. I have to confess to you that it is daunting to read all these women's tasks and the frequency with which they have to perform them. They have to do things such as tracking children's weight and height regularly, counseling, breastfeeding, and young mothers in their community, and also teaching preschool education. There is a second worker who's called a helper, but the helper is mostly responsible for cooking and serving of food, for cleaning centers and getting water, and for taking some of these small children to the center. So pick them up from their homes and take them to the center. So this is not a 50-50 split in terms of the responsibilities within the center. Okay, so in spite of this impressive infrastructure in terms of an early childhood development system, learning levels in India are very, very low, right? So ASER, which is the Annual Status of Education Report, it is a report that is done since 2005 and a national representative sample across rural India. In 2019, for the first time, assessed outcomes for the smallest children, 4 and 5-year-olds, and it found that 53% of 4-year-olds in sort of government centers, which includes Anganwadis and pre-primary classes, can describe a picture, and only 23% can count objects. So, maybe doesn't come as such a surprise that because the worker has so many responsibilities, her time for teaching is quite constrained, right? So in fact, one of my first tasks as a postdoctoral fellow at the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab in South Asia, when I was based in Delhi, was to conduct a scoping study of Anganwadi centers in Tamil Nadu and also in Rajasthan. And I found that out of the 120 minutes that workers were supposed to be teaching preschool education, the average worker only taught 38 minutes, right? So this is quite a constraint on their actual time. All right, so what was the intervention that we evaluated? What we did is we partnered with the government of the state of Tamil Nadu to evaluate hiring an extra worker, which I'm going to call a facilitator throughout the rest of the presentation, exclusively devoted to teaching preschool education. These facilitators were hired in a 2-year contract, so they were not permanent employees of the state. They were eligible based on a criteria that was very similar to that of workers. So they had to be female, they had to be 18 years old or more, they had to reside in the local community, and they had to have passed the grade 10 board exams. Workers had a slightly higher education requirements. These facilitators were expected to work half the hours of the workers, so were paid half their salary. They received only 6 days of training at the beginning of the school year, and they were required to complete a daily register of activities. I want to stop here and just highlight a couple of things that make our context for this evaluation quite favorable, just to understand sort of the external validity of the findings that I'm about to present to you. Number one is that Tamil Nadu, in case you're not familiar with this state, is one of the more economically developed states in India, within an index of human development across the country. It comes across within the top third. Tamil Nadu had also experimented with this model. So this is not sort of us coming in and just proposing something with which they had no muscle memory whatsoever. It had experimented with a similar model in the 1980s and 90s with funding from the World Bank. But once the funding dried out, the government was no longer to sustain it. And so it was very important for us to include a discussion of cost effectiveness to show to the government that it's actually quite worth it to maintain a program like this, as I'm about to show you. And the third point, which is incredibly important, especially if you're wondering about sort of the types of training or educational requirements that are expected of workers, is that prior to our study, the government of Tamil Nadu had partnered with UNICEF to develop an early childhood education curriculum. It's incredibly detailed. So it tells you for every day from 10 to 12 p.m., which is sort of the official preschool education time, what workers are supposed to do, what types of skills they're supposed to promote, what are the activities that they're supposed to do it, with what kind of theme they're supposed to do it every week. So there is a lot of scaffolding for both the workers and now for the facilitators. Now, something that I do want to emphasize, because I think that randomized controlled trials are often piloting or evaluating interventions designed by researchers, this intervention was entirely implemented by government. So everything I'm going to show you was done by the government. JPAL, which was the research center from which we conducted the study, did not do any of this implementation or monitoring for the government itself. Okay, so in terms of sampling and randomization, our sample included 320 Anganwadi centers across 4 rural districts, which are representative of roughly a population of about 60 million people. How did we arrive there? We randomly sampled first 4 rural districts from across the state. We excluded Chennai because that's the state capital and also some metropolis that includes 7+ million people. So out of the remaining districts, we sampled these 4, stratifying our selection by geographic zones and average nutritional status. If you don't know Tamil Nadu, this is India up here. The state of Tamil Nadu is up towards the south, and the 4 colored districts are the 4 districts where we conducted our evaluation. So that was the sort of the sample for the districts. And then after that, what we did is we sampled 320 centers across those 4 districts, excluding those centers that had received interventions from other nonprofits, those who were in buildings that were shared with other centers. We wanted to make sure that we had 1 worker and 1 facilitator per center, and that we also dropped those centers which had vacancies both for the worker position and for the helper position. Okay, so we only kept those centers that only had a vacancy for the worker, and we stratified our selection by that, as well as by the project, which is a lower level administrative unit in Tamil Nadu. We randomly assigned half of those 320 centers to receive a facilitator. The control and the treatment groups were comparable at baseline. I'm not going to show you all the checks, but just so that you get an idea of what these centers look like. About 20 children were registered, 15 of which were seen at baseline. Only about a third of those centers were located next to a primary school. A very, very small percentage function jointly with another center. Most of these centers had an electricity connection. The vast majority had a kitchen, and many of them had a toilet as well. All right. In terms of the data that we collected 5 types of data. The first one, and perhaps the most important, is going to be the children's math, language, and executive function skills. We administered assessments both at baseline, which was September or October of 2016, and endline, which was March or April of 2018. We administered all of these assessments individually, so one-on-one with each child, orally and in the local language of a child. I have to say, one of my favorite parts of this project was to pilot the assessments with these children. It was just the most adorable thing I've ever seen. And at endline, the children, we assessed them both at the centers and at the households. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why we did that. Okay, so The second set of measurements, which is important for our study, is children's weight and height. We did that at the same 2 time points that I mentioned before. And at Endline, we measured the kids both at the centers and at the households. And again, I'm going to explain to you why we made that decision. We also did a survey of implementation fidelity just to make sure that the facilitators were hired, that they were paid on time, that they received the training, very basic, and I'll show you the results within a couple slides. And we also did 2 more rounds of measurement. One of them was unannounced visits to the centers to check that the centers were open on time and that the worker was attending the center and attending it on time. We did that in a roughly half of the sample that we had. And then we did a set of announced classroom observations to make sure that the share of the official preschool time that was allotted to instruction was sort of larger now than it was before, right? And we did that again in a randomly selected half of the centers about a year after the start of the implementation. So I told you that I would tell you why we administer these baseline assessments and measurements both at the center and at the household. So any impact evaluation in the Anwadi system poses a big challenge, which is that parents don't perceive these centers to be academically oriented. And so as soon as the children approach the age of 5, which is the age of preschool, they pull them out. Well, if you know anything about impact evaluations, that's not really convenient, right? Because as you can see from this graph, which is not from our study, but it is from another parallel study in the same state and in the same 4 districts, is showing you that if you look at the gray bar on Anwadi centers, a majority of 2-year-olds are enrolled in Anwadi centers, and so is for 3-year-olds. But then as they become 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds, the share of these children who remain enrolled in Anwadi centers decreases very, very fast, right? So the problem there is how to evaluate those kids, given that they're no longer in those centers, right? So we anticipated this challenge. So what we did is we collected this learning and nutrition data both at the centers and at the households during the Endline. As expected, our follow-up was higher in the household assessments. So the follow-up rate was about 33% in the centers and 89% in the households, but there was no differential attrition in either one of those samples, okay? So how should we interpret the estimates that I'm about to show you for both the center-based measurements and assessment and for the household-based measurements and assessments? Well, the center sample is reflecting the impact for the children who attended roughly consistently throughout those 2 years of the intervention, right? Whereas the household sample is capturing this intent to treat style impacts on the set of eligible children, many of whom had aged out of the center. So if you plot the age distribution of the children for the baseline, that's in blue, and then for the 2 Endlines, which are in red and green, you will see that the household Endline includes a lot more children who are at or above the age of 5, which would have aged out, quote unquote, of centers. They didn't really age out. It's just that their parents, once they approximate that age, they pull them out. All right. So now that we have sort of
Alejandro, can I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
Do you know any of those like differences on covariates for parents that do pull out their children versus those that don't? Like, yeah. How should we think about these 2 samples?
I mean, it probably wouldn't surprise you that the parents who are pulling out their kids out of Anwadi centers are perhaps the more academically oriented, to the extent that we could document that through the household surveys, right? And so think of them as sort of like the more advantaged parents. So in order to address that potential concern that we have sort of a bit of a composition effect, we also estimate the effects on what we call the common sample. So the kids that we observe both in the household and in the centers. And you will see that our estimates for that common sample are quite similar to our estimates for the centers alone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Nice.
Excellent. All right, so what did we find? Let's get to it. The first set of findings is on implementation fidelity, and we are very heartened to find that the intervention was well implemented. So virtually all the treatment centers hired a facilitator. In fact, by the first round of process monitoring, which was only 5 months after the project started, 98% of the treatment centers had a facilitator. In fact, the average facilitator was hired within 15 to 30 days of the notification from the government, which is quite impressive. Nearly all of those centers had facilitators who reported to have received the required 6 days of training. The vast majority of them had an activities register. In fact, 71% not only had an activities register, but had it updated to the day when we showed up for an unannounced visit, which is quite encouraging. And then the government circulated an order specifying what the facilitators ought to do, which is to focus on preschool instruction, and what the workers were supposed to do, which is use the additional time that they had to devote to the other myriad activities that they were responsible for, which is all of which is very encouraging. All right, what do we find in terms of center opening times? Well, we found that the addition of this facilitator reduced the likelihood of centers of being closed by the start of preschool instruction by about 9 percentage points, or about 70%. So what am I showing you here in this table? Here I'm showing you the share of centers that were open by 9 a.m. or by 10 a.m. or which were closed. The first 2 rows are obviously cumulative. If you're open by 10 a.m., if you're open by 9 a.m., you're also open by 10 a.m. So you can compare just the last 2 if you're interested in. The first 2 columns show the mean and the standard deviations for the control and the treatment group. So about 87% of the centers in the control group were open by 10 a.m., which was the official preschool start time, and about 96% of the treatment centers were open by that time, creating a difference of about 9 percentage points. So why was this happening? Well, we had the theory that because the worker was responsible for the centers and she's the one that holds the key, if someone is coming, now a facilitator who's supposed to be showing up at the same time as I am, then I better show up on time to open the center for that facilitator so that she might also start interacting with the children, right? So the presence or the introduction of this facilitator actually increased the opening times of the center.
Alejandro, can I ask a clarifying question about the intervention? Good to see you. Thanks for coming. So I was trying to reconcile. So it sounds like the intervention increased time spent on instruction overall, but it could have like substituted who was providing that instruction. So the original,
all of that. You're going to get tired of the
okay,
discussing that. And if you don't get tired and you want more, then you can tell me more. I have a bunch of appendix slides. So
excellent.
We'll go through all of that. Yeah. Great question though, but we'll focus on that in just a second. If I don't answer your question, do stop me. All right. Okay. So the centers were more likely to be open in time. That's finding number 1. Finding number 2 is that worker absence decreased by about 10 percentage points, or a 50% decrease. As I said before, this is presumable because they had to show up on time to actually open the center for the facilitator. So just like before I was showing you the share of centers that were open by 9 a.m. and 10 a.m., now I'm showing you the share of workers that had arrived by 9 a.m. and by 10 a.m. This is based on unannounced visits. So the workers didn't know that we were coming, which is very important to actually measure attendance and punctuality. So the difference between the control workers, which were showing up by 10 a.m. at 80% of the time, and the treatment workers, which were showing up by 10 a.m. 90% of the time, is about 10 percentage points. You can notice also, and consistent with the explanation that I've just provided to you, that the attendance by 10 a.m. for the workers right here and the facilitators right here is very similar, right? Which is supportive of my hypothesis that I had, that the workers are showing up to open the center for the facilitators. So that's finding number 2. Finding number 3, and going on to what Beth was pointing out, is that as we expected, the facilitator devoted more time to preschool instruction, and the worker reallocated the time that she now had to devote to other activities, particularly administrative tasks and health and nutrition tasks. All right, so let's unpack this ginormous table that I've put before you right now. So I'm just showing you the minutes per day. Remember, the total is 120 because we're only observing workers and facilitators from 10 a.m., the start of preschool education time, to 12 p.m., which is when preschool education time is supposed to stop. Okay, so that's the maximum. So we're measuring the minutes per day spent on preschool, on administrative tasks, on health and nutrition tasks, off duty, and absent. is very important. We were actually measuring these absence every 10 minutes. So it's possible that, say, for example, Beth is absent for the first 2 snapshots, and then she shows up for the 3rd one. Not that she would ever show up late to anything, but I should have put myself as the example. So as you can see, the facilitators on the treatment group on average were devoting about 57 minutes per day to preschool instruction. That's a great improvement from 38 minutes per day happening in the control centers, right? And as Beth was already hinting to, the treatment workers were now spending only 18 minutes per day. Why? Because they were devoting more time to administrative tasks, 35 minutes per day, and to health and nutrition tasks, 10 or around 11 minutes per day. And also to some slack time, right? So 43 minutes per day off duty, right? Now, off duty is an odd category in that, if we couldn't see the worker, we could have marked her as being off duty, even though she was sort of like out in the community doing other things, right? We did try to check with a helper to just triangulate what that worker was doing, but it's possible that some of the time attributed to off duty is due to actual things that she was doing in the communities. So number 1, the facilitator devoted more time to preschool instruction. Number 2, the worker substituted away from preschool instruction and devoted more time on administrative tasks, health and nutrition tasks, and off duty. In fact, if you combine the time that the facilitators and the workers were devoting to preschool instruction, now the impact on the preschool instruction time on the centers was about 38 additional minutes, which means that workers and facilitators eventually doubled the time spent on preschool instruction relative to the control group. If you make the same comparison for administrative tasks, health and nutrition tasks, and off-duty, you can see improvements across the board. I would particularly point out the improvement for health and nutrition tasks. They nearly triple the time, the total time that is spent on health and nutrition, even though it's very little time, the relative improvement is quite large, right? So I'm going to flag now that I have data on each one of these more disaggregated. So if you want to sort of discuss this further in the Q&A, I'm happy just to show you, say, for example, what were they doing with that additional time in instruction? How are they spending it differently? All right. All right, so that is finding number 1, centers are more likely to be open. Finding number 2, workers are more likely to show up. Finding number 3, the allocation of time is happening as expected, with facilitators devoting more time to preschool instruction and the workers devoting more time to health and nutrition. So what was the benefit to the children? Number 1, the children were more likely to perform better on math, language, and executive function tests. I'm happy to discuss what went into those tests, but they're pretty sort of standard assessments of early literacy and numeracy and executive function for developing countries. We did quite a bit of a review and we implemented what was feasible in this context. So the improvements here are shown in standard deviations, but I could also show you the improvements and proportion correct results. This is about 0.29 standard deviation improvement in math, 0.46 standard deviation improvement in language, 0.18 improvement in executive function among the center assessments, which if we put them all together into a composite score would be about an improvement of 0.28 standard deviations. Now, as I had anticipated to you before, if you see panel B, which is focusing on the household assessments, the impacts are all lower, and they're lower because all these children were getting far less exposure, as I mentioned before. And in fact, the result for executive functioning is no longer statistically significant, right? But it is consistent with the story that the introduction of this facilitator actually improved learning outcomes across the board. All right. That would have been great in and of itself. We checked whether we saw any sense of heterogeneity by children's baseline performance. We see that all children are benefiting, regardless of whether you plot these benefits by the baseline distribution of achievement, which is what I'm showing you in panel B, or whether you do this in terms of treatment, quantile treatment effects, which is what I'm showing you in panel A. So either way, it shows that children across the board, the lower performing, the middle performing, the high performing, were benefiting from this intervention. That would have been great if we had just ended that study there. But then what we found was quite surprising to us, which is that we found that this additional time that the worker was devoting to health and nutrition was also benefiting children in terms of health and nutrition. So I'm showing you here a big table. Columns 1 through 3 are showing you the effect on children's weight. That WAS that you're seeing, I guess I didn't fulfill my promise because I did show you another acronym, is their weight for age Z-score. What does that mean? Well, the World Health Organization has established sort of normings for standards for what means to be underweight, severely underweight, and sort of like having an adequate weight, right? So according to this, Z-scores being 2 standard deviations below the global standards would be underweight, being 3 standard deviations below the global standards would be severely underweight. That's what I'm showing you in column 3. Then columns 4 through 6 are doing the exact same thing for height for age. So the impact on children's height. So I'm showing you those children who were growth stunted on column 5 and those children who were severely growth stunted on column 6. What am I showing you? All right, so let's focus for a second on panel A, column 1. I'm showing you that for the average child, there was an improvement in their weight for age Z-score of about 0.1 standard deviations. And I'm showing you in column 4 that there was an improvement in their height for age Z-score of about the same magnitude, 0.1 standard deviations. In fact, the intervention reduced the share of children who were severely underweight by about 3 percentage points, and it reduced the share of children who were stunted by about 5 percentage points, and the share that was severely stunted by 2.3 percentage points. This is remarkable for 2 reasons. Number 1 is that these are pretty old children. We're not talking about interventions to improve the nutrition of children in age 0 to 2, right? We're more used to seeing impacts on catch-up growth and the like. This is an improvement on children who are on generally ages 3 to 6. That's number 1. Number 2, as I showed you a couple of slides ago, the sort of baseline time that the workers were devoting to health and nutrition was not much, right? The improvement was a triple of that time, but we're starting from a very low baseline, right? And so even sort of this small absolute but relatively large improvement was sufficient to improve the nutritional outcomes of these children, which tells you something about sort of the need in this particular context. Now, as before, the impacts on the household measurements, which are shown on panel B, are smaller, and in this case, across the board, statistically insignificant. That's perhaps not surprising, given that the main nutritional benefit that children get from being in the centers is by getting their noon meal or getting any snacks provided through the centers, right? And so if you're not attending the centers, maybe it's not surprising that you're not going to see those nutritional benefits. We see, again, just like for the test scores, we're seeing these impacts on weight for age and height for age across the board. So regardless of whether you were sort of more likely to be stunted or less likely to be stunted, or more likely to be underweight or less likely to be underweight, you're benefiting from the program by roughly similar magnitude. So then, as I said at the very beginning, one thing that we really cared about was the cost effectiveness of this intervention. Why did we care about that? Well, because if this was a model that the state of Tamalado once considered, in fact, it experimented with, but then discarded when foreign funding dried out, then it became quite important to demonstrate to them that it was worth the investment, right? So what are we doing here? We're doing a 3-part cost benefit analysis. The first one, we're projecting the future earnings that these children are likely to see based on the relationship that we have observed between test scores and earnings for developed countries, which is not an ideal situation. But one of our co-authors, Christopher Walters and Pat Klein, have done this review of the relationship between wages and test scores. They published that separately. And so we're using their average estimates, which compares quite similarly with some of the estimates provided by Raschetti and his team in terms to estimate, to use that to estimate the relationship between test score improvements and earning gains. In panel B, we're trying to then factor in our test score effect, which is across the 3 subjects about a 0.11 of a standard deviation. And then in part C, what we're doing is we're comparing the benefits of the program with the benefit cost, the cost of the program itself, right? So once we do that, we find a benefit cost ratio of about 12.9, which which is quite positive. Now, you might think, Ale, I don't believe your parameters. I could have chosen very different parameters, and I agree with you. So what we did is we actually, for every parameter that we sort of like inputted, we drew from a sort of a distribution where we took the parameter that we chose as the center of that distribution. And you can see, so our preferred benefit cost estimates are shown in both panels in the black dashed line. And then you're seeing in the gray lines, the 9 and the 5th and 95th percentile of those benefit cost ratios and how they would be adjusted if we sampled from different parameters. You can see that whether the benefit cost ratio is 5 or whether it is 30 or 40, the point is it seems quite large, right? So it does seem it does seem worth investing in this intervention. Now, we were quite conservative in the cost benefit analysis and only including the benefits to education. So we are only factoring in here the benefits through test scores. However, one could argue that because we're also seeing these benefits in height for age or in stunting, we could use a similar approach to actually estimate the benefit cost ratio of this intervention, factoring in these benefits as well, right? So again, we don't have a sort of a previous panel study in India that would tell us if you benefit from nutrition at age 5, what does that look like for you in terms of earning at, in adulthood. We did have a study done in Guatemala that tracked a cohort for about that period of time. And so we use that relationship between improvements in nutrition at an early age and improvements in earnings at a later age to do a similar exercise. And if we factor in these additional benefits, then our benefit cost ratio can increase up to 22. My personal takeaway of this is less about the specific numbers and more to show that it is quite worth investing in this intervention. Now, I don't think I have it here, but let me just do this let me just tell you about what we found, which is in addition to this trial, we had a similar trial with 3 other nutrition-focused interventions. One of them was to just increase the pay of workers, right? And that might feel very natural to many people. In fact, many within the Anganwadi system are advocating for a pay increase across the board for Anganwadi workers because they're very underpaid. So we actually had a separate experimental arm in which we tested the effect of increasing the pay of workers across the board. We found no effects across the board on both nutrition and education outcomes. And therefore, so we not only present this benefit cost ratio as the only way of making sense of the why it is worth to invest in this intervention, we also compare it in our paper to the benefit cost ratio of this alternative policy to actually show you that just increasing the staff within the center seems to be the right approach as opposed to improving everyone's pay, at least within the short term that we can observe within this intervention. And if any of you are wondering, we are obviously very interested in tracking these children over time. We're very much looking forward to that. So what do I think are the main contributions of this paper? And I'll wrap up over here so that we open it up for questions. Number one is that it's possible to improve early childhood education with a scalable, cost-effective intervention implemented by the government in the largest early childhood care program in the world. We think that's quite an important contribution by itself. Second one, and sort of related to the discussion that I was bringing up earlier, that it might be possible for interventions to promote this catch-up growth among children between ages 3 and 5. To our knowledge, there's very little experimental evidence from developing countries showing this catch-up growth at this age period. And so we built on one of our colleagues, Abhijit Singh's work on noon meals in India to show that this type of catch-up growth is actually quite possible. Number 3 is that the hiring of this community level staff at lower than civil service salaries. So the workers in Agumwadi systems are paid roughly 1/3 of what the secondary school teachers are paid, just for you to have sort of a relative magnitude. So expanding staff at this level may be a promising option for expanding state capacity. It would be prohibitive to hire this additional worker if you had sort of the same civil service rates that you would have for secondary school teachers in India. Number 4 is, whereas we think that qualifications may be important at different levels of child development and at different levels of a country's infrastructure to provide early childhood education, for this state, at this moment, the lack of qualifications may not be a full constraint to the educator effectiveness. And that is partly also informed by all the favorable conditions that I was discussing before, right? The fact that they've tried this model before, the fact that they have a very highly prescriptive education curriculum, and so on and so forth. And then finally, that while the evidence on sort of smaller child to educator ratios is quite mixed in developing countries, it might be quite beneficial potentially for younger children. Now, this is not a straight class size reduction for all the economists in the room, because really, as I was telling Beth before, the facilitator is hired to provide that education so that the worker may go ahead and do other things, right? But if you wanted to think about it as a resources intervention, then potentially you could think of it as, well, to the extent that there is smaller child to educator ratios, then that might be more important in this particular age age period of the children. All right, that is all I had, but I am very much looking forward to diving into all of my appendix slides that I've spent an inordinate amount of time preparing to engage with your questions. Thank you for being so patient. And
Thanks,
just
Alejandro. Yeah, please, John, kick us off.
Great. Thanks so much, Ale. It was fun to see you present this. A question I have is just thinking a little bit about like the political economy of scale up. So I was looking at the conclusion of your paper, and you note that there would be jobs, that the supply of people who could be the supplementary worker is likely, at least in Tamil Nadu and other parts of India, not to be a constraint. But when you think a little bit about like how that would scale through a government system, given that would they be contract workers or would they be like regularized? It's something that we've struggled when we've thought about the scale up of, say, like teaching at the right level as well. So just, yeah, given that you're thinking about this, yeah, can you just share like your insights with me about how you're thinking about like the scalability and the sustainability?
Thank you, John. I think that's a very important question about how to think about scale up. I think we all remember the lessons from the extra teacher program in Kenya, in which, for those of you who are not familiar, in a short-term impact evaluation of hiring teachers on contracts for a limited period of time, I believe those teachers were hired on a 1-year renewable basis. The intervention worked well, and once it was conducted by the government, it was not even implemented, so therefore it didn't have the benefits. And then obviously the extra workers then lobbied for a permanent position. I think one thing that makes the Agumwadi system or Icds different from sort of the regular civil service system is that I don't think that workers are in the same sort of legal status as the teachers, right? And so even if you were to potentially be in a similar situation, you would not be facing sort of the same fiscal constraint that you would be facing if you were to face the situation with secondary school teachers, right? So I think that that's one issue to consider. The other issue to consider is, I think, many of these women who sort of applied for a facilitator job are within a very constrained but potentially very useful local labor market, right? Unlike the teacher, which could move from city A to city B to actually pursue a job that she wants to take on, the Agumwadi worker markets, our labor markets, are extremely localized, right? Like you have to be from the same ward, you have to be from the same hamlet, you have to be from the same village to actually take this up. And so it's not as clear to me me that if I find sort of a very favorable position in Chennai, I'm going to move from, say, Karur to Chennai just to take on that position and then demand that I become stable. It just doesn't seem to have the same characteristics as that. I do think, though, that any a legal framework that is developed to scale up this intervention should be extremely clear about what happens to the facilitators after their contract is expired, right? So we haven't, to the credit of the government, it's this intervention ended in 2018. We're now in 2021, obviously with pandemic and everything in between, but we haven't seen sort of a demand from the facilitators to become regularized, right? And so I think that that's kind of also what's making the Tamil Nadu government more open to considering this. I also don't think it will be a once and for all expansion, but rather that they're going to expand it to a few more districts and then expand it to a few more districts. And I'm assuming that that iteration itself will teach them something about how to sort of ensure that sort of this potential conflict between sort of labor and the government doesn't ensue in the same way that it happened for teachers. Does that help? Is that what you had in mind, John?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thanks so much, Ali. That's just, I'm just beginning to wrap my head around this more and more, and it is extremely helpful. So thank you for that.
Sheetal, and please others, feel free to jump in.
Hi, Alejandro, and thank you so much for a very interesting talk. It was very educational and interesting. I just have a bunch of comments. I'm just going to segment them and maybe let others chime in as well. But so one is around the point of wrapping around, what is the treatment/intervention? It to me, it seems like it's a bundled treatment. You have also improved the accountability of these permanent employees of the Anganwadi centers by these surveys or the audit visits that you were doing, right? So in this literature, there is this issue of accountability of the public employees. So, Esther and Rima and Ryan have a paper which look at like sort of the accountability is a problem and these agents multitask. So maybe you just improved their, effort levels or such, but it's a bundled treatment. So how do we kind of wrap our head around what exactly is going on? Is the policy implication, think of this as a policy and do everything that we did? The second is, about, how do these workers compare to the Anganwadi workers in terms of both education qualifications? Are they better at maybe teaching the kids or at certain tasks? And also in compensation, because, Anganwadi centers are health employees of the state government. They get many different benefits. They get pensions. And did you kind of think about that when you were thinking about your cost benefit analysis? And I think the third one was more along the lines of like, I bet you have done a lot of work around this, but this is a very large intervention and perhaps these workers know each other and talk to each other. Are there any spillovers? So I think I'll pause there and let others chime in.
Sure. Thank you for that. That's super helpful. So I think number one, I think the treatment definition is just the extra worker, right? I think it's important to highlight that our intervention monitoring rounds were just 2 across sort of a 2-year period. So we showed up twice. And what we did is we just asked, is the worker hired? When was the facilitator? When was the facilitator hired? Is there an activities register? And we checked the date, right? So I think it's harder to tell a story where those 2 visits sort of nudged all the workers to show up more and in time. And in terms of measurement, I can tell you, we did the same rounds of measurement in the other 3 interventions that I didn't present to you today, and nothing moved, right? So had it been just the fact that we were measuring kids, I guess we would have seen it there too, right? So that's number one. Number 2 is the educational qualifications. So is just grade 10 for facilitators, grade 10 board exams, and then grade 12 for the workers. So I don't think it's a huge difference in terms of sort of those 2 years of extra education. It also, they weren't requiring any specific, preschool education degrees or anything like that. The time in terms of training, like pre-service training, the average amount of time that the average amount of days that the workers receive per year in terms of PD is about 6 days, which matches up quite nicely with the average amount of time that the facilitators receive for the training. So not that it couldn't have happened, it just didn't seem to be sort of an important difference. It also, again, and I mean, obviously people deviate from scripts, but I cannot emphasize to you enough, like how prescriptive the Tamil Nadu curriculum is in terms of sort of what you're supposed to do with each time and each time slot within the day. And so it doesn't really seem like there's a huge range for innovation the way that there would be, say, in some of the Latin American preschool centers where I have done related work, right? In terms of pensions, they didn't get pensions because they're contract-based teachers, contract-based educators. I think that, as John was saying, to the extent that we're concerned that they would demand sort of regularization, that would become a problem, but it wasn't a problem during the intervention. And in terms of salary, as I mentioned, they were expected to work half the time of the workers, so they were paid sort of half the rate accordingly, right? So in that sense, the payment was the same per hour, I guess, if that makes sense. But I know that we have some time afterwards, you and me. So we should discuss some of these things. I'm very curious as to what you have in mind. Thank you, Shita.
I'll jump in here. That was really a great presentation, very fascinating. I was interested in, like, have you all looked into the heterogeneity of the results across the different centers? I'd be really interested to know, like, if you plotted I don't know how well powered you are to do this, but if you sort of plotted the impact across however many centers, is this driven by a very consistent impact across all of the centers? Is it, is there a lot of heterogeneity there? And then also I'm wondering if you all looked into trying to sort of tease apart, for instance, is there variation in terms of how the time allocation across centers? And so, for instance, are places that are spending more time on instruction, are those the places where you see the bigger impacts, for instance?
Thank you, Brendan. Yeah, so we did heterogeneity both by center. So we looked at things like that we thought could be potentially meaningful, such as like whether there was a vacancy by the worker at the time of the start of the study, whether the number of students that were either registered or observed in that center, those kinds of factors. We didn't find any evidence of heterogeneity, which seemed to indicate that across the board, all different types of centers were doing quite well. Now, like that is not as well powered as the child level heterogeneity, and we didn't find any evidence of child level heterogeneity either, so I didn't show it to you, but let me see if I can just reshare for a sec. Shannon, don't kill me. Oops. So this is sort of, we looked at this is for the assessments. I guess it's not baseline WAS score, but it's just the baseline test score. So we found the only thing that we found some suggestive evidence for was heterogeneity for female children who benefited slightly more. But once you correct for multiple hypothesis testing, that benefit goes away. Anything else for the child, like age, mother education, and other sort of characteristics, just weren't as meaningful. And then I love your other comment, which I've gotten before and then forgotten to include into the paper, but yes, we did find that the centers that are benefiting more, the children who are benefiting more are at centers where that increase is sort of like more easy to observe, right? Obviously, that's not, we didn't randomly assign the time to preschool instruction, so you have to be very careful about how to interpret that, but that consistency that you were pointing out as potentially there is indeed there. That's a great point. Right.
Let's do Ramiz, Daphna, Todd.
Hey, hi, and thanks for letting me into this meeting. And when he was talking about Anganwadi, one interesting thing I want to tell you, I am from Delhi, and in my parking, there is Anganwadi classes going on regular basis. So the condition you have told or showed is quite different here. And the only intervention that can be made and that will change the thing is about their pay and their hiring of Anganwadi workers. Their situation is, extremely bad. They are like paid less than $50 a month, and they are not on regular basis. Most of the time, they are not paid for like 6 to 7 months, even in the pandemic. So, and one more thing, the background of the children is like on the paper, they are, sometimes I interact with them as like they are in my parking. So sometimes I, just like talking to them about how the things are going on. They are like, there is, backlog about the students. The number of candidates on paper is different from the real classroom, because there is, this chain is working in very different way on paper, in reality. So it's the only motto the student or the children here are coming for the midday meal. And I haven't seen any other progress, just like 4 to 5 Anganwadi. Most of their time, it's like maintaining discipline or and ask children to just sit at their place. It's like that only. So, and you have chosen Tamil Nadu, one of the most, highest percentage of literacy. Even I am from Delhi, the capital city of India, and the situation in Anganwadi here is like that. So if you consider some rural area like Bihar or UP, so there are the only intervention I just want to hear, it's about the payment and their regularization of their job. That's all I have to say. So I just like sharing my experience of my Anganwadi with your Anganwadi.
That's lovely. I was based in Delhi, so I actually visited a fair amount of Anganwadis there over the 2 years that I was there. I also visited Anganwadi centers in Rajasthan, which was the other state where we were considering partnering with the government to do a similar impact evaluation, not particularly of an extra worker intervention, but other strategies to improve early childhood development. And let me tell you, those Anganwadis varied in size, shapes, numbers, everything, right? So one of the Anganwadis that I visited was smaller than my office right here, right? It was about like half my office. So I point completely taken that Anganwadi centers vary quite a bit. I think that's why we're very careful about saying that this is about rural Tamil Nadu. Number one, as you pointed out, a state that is very economically developed. And number two, rural areas where the conditions for Anganwadis are very different and the role that they play in the community is very different than they do in urban centers. Another difference, which I only mentioned in passing, is I think in urban areas such as Delhi or such as Chennai, a lot of these Anganwadi workers are sharing spaces across centers or sharing workers across centers. So we don't have that situation here either. So absolutely, so where you are in India matters in terms of sort of how propitious the context will be to implement this intervention. That's number one. Number two is, for those of you who might not be familiar with how wages of Anganwadi workers are set, the central government is sort of commits to a minimum, and then the states are supposed to top off. Some states do extremely well topping off. Some states don't do anything at all to actually top off. And so the workers are only receiving sort of the baseline from the central government. And so I think understanding where the context is ripe in terms of sort of having a sufficient pay for the workers to not be introduced to a facilitator in a context where they're not even getting sort of the bare minimum, as Ramesh was pointing out, I think seems interesting and useful to think about. As I was saying, sort of this is sort of the context where we did this, right? And so in this context, it was a little bit more favorable than it might be in other states in India in terms of sort of the wages. So that's number 2. In terms of number 3, which is sort of like, well, what is happening in these Agmadi centers? So I agree with you that a lot of what I've seen in the centers was more focused towards, you were pointing out, discipline, or maybe just fulfilling routines, right? Like taking children to the toilet, making them eat, making sure that they nap, making them making sure that the entrance and exit from the center is very orderly. And that does happen sort of across India. I think that's why I pointed out so much the fact that in the state of Tamil Nadu, they have this sort of like ECC curriculum, because I think that looked quite different from what I had seen in other states. And it wasn't just the existence of the curriculum, as you're pointing out. I think that they have sort of an implementation capacity that is quite different from that of other states, right? And so their own system of supervisors, CDPOs, DPOs is much more robust than it would be in other states. And that's super important to point out, for sure. And I'm very jealous. I want to visit a Nagawani center very soon. So I'm really, really hoping that I can travel to India soon to do that as well. But I appreciate that your interaction with all the kids in the neighboring Nagawani.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, this was a super great talk. Thank you. And I had 2 questions. One, you kind of mentioned in passing this other arm of the study around pay, and you mentioned that it didn't have impact on child outcomes. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether it had impact on non-child outcomes like the attendance and hours spent, and just whether teachers were likely to attend. And the other maybe is a clarifying question, but it seemed like the preschool day was so short, like the intervention itself was maybe 2 hours total. And I wondered if I first understood that right, like if the preschool job for the facilitators was 5 hours a week, if it's half that time that they're working and just very part-time, but also if I've understood that right, like whether there've also been studies looking at just more time, like giving the teacher more time to interact with the kids, so that, you know, if she has this long list and there were 2 hours and now there's 3 hours to do them, maybe the teacher could get to them more. So yeah, any thoughts on either of those would be great.
Thank you, Daphne. Those are great. So on the across-the-board pay increase intervention, we didn't actually conduct the unannounced visits and the announced visits because it was a nutrition-focused intervention, right? So I actually can't tell you whether it improved sort of the attendance of the workers or the time on task. We just have no data on that, unfortunately. In terms of a short time for preschool education, fully agree. I think that most people would favor an expansion, if including some of the workers, I'm sure. It's important though to consider something that I haven't told you, which is before the official preschool time in Tamil Nadu is welcoming time, right? So from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. the center is supposed to be open, but there's, you know, a collection of kids coming into the center. So you typically will see the helper go around the village, pick up some of the kids, mothers and grandmas bringing some of those kids. There's sort of like them just eating their like morning snack and whatever. And maybe there's like some song and rhyme going on right at the beginning. So that first hour is taken up by that. Then at 12, they have let me see, actually, give me 1 second. I want to show you like what a calendar looks like. If I can just do this quickly enough. I think I can. I don't think that I will find it. If I do find it, I will show it to you. So after the lunchtime, which is 12 to 1, they have nap time. And after nap time, the older kids are supposed to stay on to do what is known as school readiness. So it's not for all the children. So the younger children are supposed to go home at that point. So I think that there is a recognition that more time would improve outcomes. I don't know, like, so from the very unsystematic visits that we did to the centers, just prepping for the study, it didn't seem like that school readiness section was consistently implemented. And so that's why we didn't sort of like focus on observing that period either. But I think that there is a recognition that more time could help. That's all I could tell you really in terms of like evidence based in India that's experimental, quasi-experimental in terms of like increasing time in Anganwadis. Neither of my answers was super satisfying, but hopefully when we do the one-on-one, I can show you the schedule that I was scrambling to find.
Yes, thank you so much for this talk. It was super interesting, really exciting work and findings. I was really struck by the findings on children's height and weight and stunting. And I was wondering, forgive me if I missed this, but were the midday meals, do you have data on whether those were administered as intended or administered equally across the treatment and control group? And then also, it seems like you don't have as much information on what the Anganwadi workers were able to do like in the communities, but do you have any data on sort of parental engagement and how that might factor in?
Yeah, great question, Todd. So I don't have data like a table to show you in terms of sort of the implementation of a noon meal. That is sort of like, that has been a feature of Anganwadis for a long time now. So I wouldn't expect our intervention to change how that is administered for two main reasons. Number one is sort of the amount of money that each center is given to purchase the rations for the kids is kind of like fixed at the sort of the state level. So there's nothing about, say, the facilitator being introduced that could sort of like, say, lead to an increase or decrease in the amount of money that the center has to provide that. But also it is mostly the worker and the helper who are doing that work, right? Like the helper is the one who's cooking the midday meal, and then she's helping the worker actually distribute it. And so we did find some indication in self-reported data, not unannounced, not observations, that the facilitator was saying that she was sometimes used, sort of like asked to help with health and nutrition tasks. So potentially that could play a role. Sort of the self-report data though doesn't sort of match up with what we observe in the centers, and so it's like kind of hard to make sense of that. If we had seen sort of like an increase in the health time devoted to health and nutrition among the facilitators from observed data, then that would be sort of a more compelling hypothesis to think about. Well, did the introduction of the facilitator improve the way in which the meals were distributed or something, right? I think also there's only about like 14, 15 kids per center on average. So the distribution of the meal is sort of like pretty standard, right? In terms of sort of, it's not like you have like many kids to feed, and so potentially you couldn't get to all of them or something like that, which could be the case in larger centers, but that is less likely to be the case in sort of the rural centers, which are smaller. All right, so that's number one. Number two, I forgot already. Todd, remind me.
No, I was just wondering about the parental engagement. I guess my broader
Sorry, go ahead.
mechanism for seeing those effects, given that it was a tripling of the time, but it was still, I think, only about 15 minutes. So I was just curious of how that sort of translated to, or how you think that might translate to the effects on nutrition.
Yeah, so we actually have a pretty robust household survey for parents. We don't have a lot of questions on what the parents were doing to stimulate children. And so that's why we didn't bring this into this paper. Most of the data that we have are on household expenditure, so for different types of activities, and also where they sent their kids to school if they were not sending them to the Anganwadi, right? And we didn't find really sort of that parents were responding in any systematic way, either by increasing the resources that they were devoting to these children, or by sort of like, you know, shifting them to a more favorable or academically oriented center after the intervention, right? So that's all we can tell, which is pretty limited. I think I would have loved, having the benefit of hindsight, to have administered a lot more questions and sort of what they were doing. It's possible, as your point may be suggesting, that the facilitator crowded in a lot of productive parental behaviors, say, for example, like reading to the child or talking to the child more, which could have sort of like enhanced the effects of the facilitator herself. In terms of nutrition, there's a number of potential mechanisms that could be going on, none of which we have airtight data to demonstrate. Number one is, as I mentioned, the workers are tracking the weight and the height of the children regularly, right? So there's actually like a lovely register with differently colored areas showing you, say, if you increase from one day to the next, or from one period to the next, whether you made it from, say, undernourished to normal, so on and so forth. So it could be just that now that the workers have a little bit more time, they do that more systematically, or they keep closer tabs on the kids. And now they sort of like, they can see with a less of a lag where children stand, and therefore react accordingly, right? So one of them is maybe a potentially more time to focus on children's nutrition and height and weight, right? The other one could just be that, either they just, with the extra time that they have, they talk more to the mothers, as you were suggesting before, in their home visitations. The other one that could be the case would be that there's something about the information that they, so the nutrition that they improve for the children. I don't again understand how that would happen. So I'm a little bit lost for that third possibility. But I think certainly maybe through greater awareness of where the children are nutritionally, or through interaction with the mothers, those could be two very plausible mechanisms if there were any spillover effects of spillover effects. Great question though.
Alejandro, I have like a very zoom out big picture question,
Yes,
which
let's
is
zoom out.
like, so we didn't hear that much about the sort of salary experiment, but it occurs to me that at least in K-12 and in the US, there's sort of often observers kind of put those two options in conflict with each other. Like we have to choose lower class sizes or like teacher quality. And so I'm just wondering like what your kind of, what are your big picture takeaways about kind of the answer to that question, and what are the like sort of factors on which it depends the most? Like, is it the age of the kids? Is it the context? Is it developing context versus, is it the local labor market? Like what are sort of like the big picture takeaways about that debate that you feel like you've learned from this work?
It's a good question, but I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to provide you with a satisfying answer. And the reason for that is I think the need in this context is very specific. It just happens to be a context that educates 1 in every 5 children in the world, right? But, when we were doing these unannounced visits to the center, like prior to this study, and discovering like on average they were getting 38 minutes of preschool instruction per day. That's not even close to what I've observed in Latin America, right? Like so even farther away from the US and other developed nations. The fact that I could show you sort of the list of tasks that an Anganwadi worker has, it is just humanly impossible. It doesn't matter how productive of a human being you are to do all 21 of those tasks, and let alone to do them well, right? And so you do have sort of this conflict of how to allocate your time. The other thing is, I didn't mention this, which would have been a nice complement to the context setting, but we surveyed Anganwadi workers before our study, right? And they thought they were underpaid and overworked, right? And so to me, or I guess to the three of us, the constraint was so clear, right? It was staring at us in the face. It was just, they just need more time. And if you give them more time, they will do what they're supposed to do. These are not, evil or lazy or any people. They're just people who want to do their job. And if you give them that opportunity, they will take it on. I think if I can draw any zoomed out lesson from that, is I think our debates about educators in general in the US and in developing countries is very monitoring, accountability focused, and perhaps don't throw stones at me, please, because of this group. Perhaps because it's been influenced by economists, very distrusting of our educators. And sometimes you know, when we find things like this, we're surprised when maybe we shouldn't be. Maybe a lot of people are trying to do the best that they can, and they're just waiting for you to give them a fair shot at trying to do their job. That's the only zoomed out lesson that I could draw.
Awesome. Well, I apologize for monopolizing the last question, everybody, but thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Alejandro for being with us today, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.